so that we have time to get through all of our presentations. Welcome to our Compliance Transformation for Finance and IT session. Thanks for coming back if you were here for the first one, and thanks for joining if you're just now coming in. And welcome Kate Williams and Josh Cross, who work on my team and are amazing, so you'll really enjoy the presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to them. Just a few housekeeping things. We will send the slides after the presentation today. We will also email out your CPE certificates, so make sure you answer the polling questions. If you have any questions while we're speaking, send it through the Q&A, and I'll try to get them answered. And if not, we'll get them answered at the end, or we'll contact you after. And I think that's it. So I'll let Kate and Josh take it from here.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. So I'm Kate Williams. I'm the manager of the IT security and compliance practice here at Maxwell Lock & Ritter. My main focus is helping our clients with things like SOC 1 and SOC 2 examinations, internal controls, evaluations, risk assessments, and other IT-related services for IT compliance. Josh, do you want to do a quick intro now?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no problem. Good morning, guys. My name is Josh Cross. I'm the IT director here at Maxwell Lock & Ritter. I've been with the firm a little over 13 years. Before that, I spent about 6 years doing IT work in the airline industry, for United Airlines and US Airways. And, I will be kind of going over a security debrief of just kind of the recent threats and kind of lessons learned.
Perfect. Thank you. So quick game plan for the day. We're going to talk through cost-effective strategies to improve regulatory and IT compliance. That'll be my focus area for today. And then we'll switch to Josh again for a security debrief with lessons learned from the top security threats of 2021. So we'll start with compliance transformation, the cost-effective strategies to improve compliance at your organization. So compliance transformation, we've set up into 4 different steps. That's knowledge gathering, compliance at scale, people-centric compliance, and compliance automation. We'll start with knowledge gathering. So knowledge gathering is the process of understanding and assigning risks, regulations, and responsibilities. So what we want to keep in mind here is that every compliance-related task that you do as an organization should tie to a specific risk to your organization or to a regulation that you're required to comply with. So knowledge gathering is the process of understanding those things so you can design your compliance program and compliance tasks around the things that you actually need to do as an organization. So to do this, we'll think through 4 factors. We're going to think through the data that we have, the data we store, the systems and infrastructure that we use, the regulations that apply to us, and what our customers and employees expect of us as an organization. So we're going to run through a quick example of what this could look like. So here's an easy example for a small software company. So think of this as a software company going through this process that I'm talking through. So they went through and they have these buckets of information: data, systems and infrastructure, regulations, and expectations. So they did a review of their organization and figured out what customer information do we have. We have their email address, we have their company name, what employee data do we have? Looks like that's some sensitive information with those social security numbers. Business data, do we have sensitive business data? That could be customer lists, prospect lists. Systems and infrastructure, that's the process of going through and saying, what are the significant systems that are either business critical for us or contain sensitive information? So in this example, we have NetSuite, that'd be the general ledger software. So that would obviously be critical. Office 365. Here we have a finance server, but we also use AWS for hosted infrastructure. So capturing all of that information. For regulations and expectations, we pulled together that we have labor laws that we have to comply with. We have customer expectations that we respond to customer support requests or security incidents in a matter of hours. So this is this initial process. going through to pull together this information to cater your compliance program. So this is a pretty good starting point, but we also pulled together some tips to make it even better. The first tip is to ask for input across departments. So let's say with this initial example, we just had the CEO and CFO involved. So this is what the CEO and CFO was able to pull together. Let's say now we pull in the CTO and the IT team. So now we have broader information that's more valuable when we're thinking through the risks and compliance activities we want to focus on. So we see that the CTO knows that we have authentication information for our customers that's sensitive. We have source code that could be considered a sensitive business asset. The IT team is aware we have a PCI terminal where we take certain credit card information over the phone and input it into a PCI terminal. And therefore, PCI is a relevant law or regulation. And the IT team is also aware that we promise customers system uptime of 99% or more. Now, keep in mind that this is a software company example. I realize there are many industries covered in this webinar, but customer expectations could also be stakeholder expectations, depending on kind of the purpose of your organization and who your end consumer is, your end customer is. So next, we have another tip called play devil's advocate. So the important thing about this, as you're going through this risk assessment process, is that you want to internally find the gotchas. You don't want an external regulator to come in and say, oh, I got you, you didn't comply with this regulation. You want to find that out internally. So this is the process of thoroughly going through the results and identifying what you missed. So in this case, maybe we have one really big customer in the UK. So GDPR, which is a data protection regulation in the UK, might be applicable to us. So let's include that as well. Our final tips, surface the risks. So this is the process of really digging in and evaluating what we pulled together to see what jumps out as a risk. And when we say risk, it's things like maybe sensitive information that we're not protecting like we should, or commitments that we're making to customers that we're not actually complying with. Or it could be really broad concepts like market adjustments that we aren't, that we need to keep in mind as we're making strategic business decisions. So this is obviously a lot of content, and we will share these slides, so don't feel like you need to read all these words, but just to talk through a few examples. So say we understand now that customer lists are a sensitive business asset. We don't want everyone to see our customer lists for a couple of reasons. One, that could be really critical to our business in general, and it could also be include sensitive information on our customers that we don't want to get leaked anyway. So the risk here could be, we know that salespeople are terminated, but we don't necessarily track removal of their Salesforce access. So that's a risk that we perceive in our organization, that we aren't diligent about removing access from the sales team to Salesforce, where this customer list information lives. Here we also find that authentication information is some sensitive customer data that we have. And our customers expect us to encrypt customer data at rest. And so that's clearly a risk. We have a finance server that's no longer supported, it's end of life, which creates a risk of that being breached. We have system uptime percentage promises that for our customers, but we don't have a way of tracking uptime. That could be a risk. So this process looks very, very different for each organization, but hopefully this gives you a sense of what the process looks like and how you think through those steps. The final component of knowledge gathering is making a plan. So this is where you look at the risks that you identified and you come up with concrete steps to limit, reduce, or mitigate those risks. So if I have any clients on the call, I know that I help them make much more complex risk assessments than this. But this is a great example of a starting point. If you don't have a risk assessment process in place, this is a really easy format to get one started. So we have the risks listed here, the rating. There are pretty complex ways of calculating risk rating, but what it comes down to is an assessment of the likelihood that that will happen, the likelihood something bad will happen, and the impact if it did happen. So there are ways to more formally calculate that, but for purposes of getting started in a risk assessment, I'd say take the team that did the risk assessment and pulled together the information and gut reaction, how risky is each thing, and mark them as low, moderate, or high. We also have the risk owner captured. This is important because it makes sure, it gives someone ownership to make sure something actually happens to mitigate those risks. And then we have a remediation plan. This can be the hard part. Some risks are very high level, so you'll want a very high level remediation plan, and it might be a risk that never gets mitigated. It's just something that we want to keep track of and discuss over time. Other things have very concrete steps that need to be taken to mitigate the risk, and those can be included in here as well. So we'll look at a few of these examples. So our salespeople that we found out are not consistently terminated. We could obviously review Salesforce access, remove anyone that doesn't need access anymore, and we could create an offboarding checklist. Those are really helpful to track offboarding activities, including access removal. For this finance server, perhaps we could consider if we could move the contents of the server to a cloud-hosted location, either AWS that we already have or Dropbox. If not, perhaps we can upgrade the server, replace it, and move it to a locked location. The next general area of compliance that I want to talk you through is compliance at scale. So this is the process of balancing compliance requirements with compliance expectations. So there are 4 topics we'll want to think through. The industry that you're in, the data that you have, your company's size, and the stakes. And so what this means is some industries have much higher compliance requirements because they have much more sensitive information. Healthcare is a good example of that. Some companies are very small, and so that could lead to a decreased expectation of compliance in certain ways. The stakes here are things like fines for non-compliance with regulation or reputation risks if a security breach happens and that gets published in the news. And the end goal here is to create a compliance program that matches the level of risk of your organization based on these factors. So here are details from 3 example companies. We have a healthcare company. So the healthcare company has personal health information that's obviously very sensitive. They're pretty small with 10 employees. And the stakes here are HIPAA fines and reputation risks if there's a security breach that gets published. Company 2 is a manufacturing company, and the sensitive information they have are product specifications for the products they produce. They're a larger organization at 500 employees. And the stakes here, I would say, are competitive advantage. If those product specs get in the wrong hands, perhaps they lose some of their competitive advantage as a manufacturing company. Company 3, in our example, is an enterprise software company. They're very small, only 3 employees, but they have some pretty sensitive information, payroll data for a Fortune 50 company. So in this example, I would actually state that business continuity is a risk here, because if there's a breach of that payroll data for their one Fortune 50 company, they may go out of business. So next we're going to lay out the level of risk associated with each of these factors for each company. So here, healthcare, that's a high risk industry. It's very regulated. You have very sensitive information. So I'd mark that in red. Number of employees of 10 is pretty low, so you might have fewer HR requirements and regulations and expectations, so I'd mark that as green. And then HIPAA fines, reputation risks, I'd mark that as red. Manufacturing can really go either way. There's some manufacturing companies that have a lot of really sensitive information, high stakes companies where this could be yellow or red. But in this specific example, since it's just product specifications, there's not anything that would be detrimental to a lot of people outside of the organization. It would only be detrimental inside the organization. If there was a breach of the product specification data, I would mark that as green as well. So the point of all of this is if you're in one of these companies, you want to review this information to get a sense of how much we need to care about compliance, how much money we need to put into compliance, and how much spend we need to put into compliance. So I'll switch that to our first polling question. If Stacy, perfect. So the question is, how risky is your organization based on this exercise? So based on your industry, the data you store, the stakes, the company size, what do you think the level of risk is for your organization specifically? Okay. I'll go ahead and move on as those results come in. Perfect. So the results came in and it looks like about 50% say moderate, 16% at high, and 36% at low. So that's great. That's a nice even spread, but not too many people are in that high risk area. Perfect. So our next topic is people-centric compliance. This is the process of alleviating the impact of compliance to executives and employees. So this probably seems pretty counterintuitive for a compliance webinar that we're talking about alleviating the impact of compliance. But the rationale is, excuse me, the rationale is that you want to focus your time. You want your executives and employees to focus their time on the things that actually create risk for the organization. Sometimes we create compliance tasks because we think they're helpful or useful, and they end up creating too much work that pulls a person away from their core job responsibilities or away from the actual risks that they face in the organization. So the three things that I like to consider here across executives and employees are these questions of what keeps me up at night, how I add value, and what I spend time on. So the goal here is to balance what I spend time on with what keeps me up at night. And I'll go through a few examples. So first we have the CFO. So we ask the CFO these questions. What keeps them up at night? Debt covenants. But what do they spend time on? Approving $5 purchase orders. So we can clearly see that debt covenants are important from a compliance standpoint, but that's not what this CFO is able to focus on. They're busy focusing on $5 purchase orders. So the recommendations here could be tracking and centralizing contract requirements, and to decrease the compliance burden on what I spend time on, I would increase the minimum spend that gets routed to the CFO for approval. You could also invest in expense management software. So the point here is that what keeps me up at night might need additional compliance requirements and steps. And what I spend time on, maybe it's appropriate, maybe it's actually adding value, but if it's not, if it's just activity for the sake of activity, how can we bring that back so it's more reasonable? The CTO. CTO is very worried about ransomware attacks. They add value by securing systems and data, but they spend a lot of time maintaining end-of-life servers. So here we'd recommend bolstering their ransomware protection against ransomware attacks with some security awareness training and an incident management process. For securing systems and data, perhaps we could invest in security monitoring software. And for these end-of-life servers, maybe we don't want to have those anymore. Maybe it's easier for everyone if we migrate that information to the cloud so the CTO can focus more on the ways that they add value and the things that keep them up at night. And these are all concepts that Josh will go into detail about as well. Next, we have an HR manager. So the HR manager is very worried about wrongful termination lawsuits, but they spend a lot of time filing payroll tax forms. So the recommendation here could be limiting the risk of these wrongful termination lawsuits with employee trainings, creating an employee handbook, connecting with employment law professionals, and perhaps on payroll tax forms, if we're manually filing those forms, we could consider investing in payroll software or a payroll provider that handles that for us and and automates the process to a higher degree. Our final example here for people-centric compliance is a sales representative. So this is employee level. What keeps them up at night? What do they spend time on? What keeps me up at night for this sales rep is not knowing how they're doing at work. What they spend time on is manually submitting expense reports. So here I'd recommend considering annual performance reviews so employees actually know how they're doing, and decreasing the burden of manual expense reports by investing in expense management software. Our final of the 4 topics is compliance at scale, or excuse me, compliance automation. So this is the process of using systems and checklists to simplify compliance. Here we're going to focus on these 3 general tenets: systems we live in, system spend versus person spend, and considering retention. So we'll transition first into a polling question, which will help us kind of dive deeper into each of those 3 topics. So the question is, what's your company's biggest compliance pain point? Is that we don't know what our compliance requirements are, we don't have systems in place to manage compliance requirements, we don't have time to focus on compliance, or we can't show evidence of compliance tasks we completed. Perfect. I'll go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay, results are in. The biggest complaint is not having time to focus on compliance. That absolutely makes sense. Everyone has full-time jobs that keep them busy enough. And then the rest are a pretty solid mix between not knowing the compliance requirements, not being able to show evidence, and then not having systems in place to manage compliance requirements. Perfect. So each of these kind of concerns will tie back to one of these general tenets that we're going to discuss. So the first is systems we live in. So this is the concept of using systems that we already use every day to manage compliance tasks. So if you answered that you don't have systems in place to manage compliance requirements, this may be a good first step to consider. So many companies do benefit from a more robust compliance management software, but if you don't have that, if you're just starting out, if you're looking for ways to use systems that you already have, some great examples are Asana and Jira. We've helped clients implement more compliance activities in those. And I'll give you an example. So here's an example of an onboarding checklist in Asana. So say you already live in Asana as an organization. And if you don't, replace Asana with help desk system, with customer support system. There are a lot of different systems where you track specific activities, and these activities have individual checklists within them. This is just an example for Asana. So here we have an onboarding checklist. So this can
All right, guys, I think we lost Kate. So we'll give it a few seconds here and see if she can pick it back up. All right, is everybody seeing me? You guys are seeing me?
We
Okay.
see you, Josh. Sorry,
okay.
let us get the presentation back up and we'll keep going.
Yeah, no worries.
Process, right, related to employee onboarding, subcontract.
Okay, guys, can you guys see that? Sarah, chime in, let me know.
I gotcha, we see it.
Okay, perfect. So we'll just jump in. Kate had a few slides left. And so as I said before, I'm the IT director here at Maxwell Lock and Ritter. Been here for a while. And before that, I worked for a much bigger organization in the airline industry. And what I can tell you is that from a security standpoint, it doesn't really matter how big or small your environment is. We're all kind of fighting, that same battle. And a lot of times it feels like an uphill battle. And, we're consistently seeing these, large corporations and these large enterprises. And a lot of times it's security vendors that are, falling victim to ransomware attacks, or their code is being exploited and causing, major outages and a lot of downtime for their clients. And so, when we look at that and we say, hey, the big guys can't even figure out how to protect themselves. And then we look at, I look at my situation, and we're small, medium business. We have a 3-person IT department. And so how do we do this? What's the right approach? And it's something I've talked about before. If you've heard me speak, then you've heard of this layered approach to security. It's something that I believe in. There is not a one-stop shop for security. It's ever evolving. It's changing, all the time. The threats are changing, the protections are changing. So what you need is you need to put layers in there. You have to put different layers, and the way you do that is with different security vendors. And so what I'm going to talk about today is just kind of go through some of the recent threats that we've seen this year. And I think a lot of you will have recognized these names because they've been in the news, and just kind of walk through our methodology and the way that we have these different layers, and how some of them don't work, but some of them do work. And as long as you have a bunch of different layers there, that you can kind of mitigate the process there. So kind of moving
Josh,
on. Yep.
Sorry.
No, there's Kate.
I got disconnected. I'm so sorry. So I came back on my iPhone hotspot. But Josh, I think just carry on. And then if there's time for me to jump back into my presentation, there wasn't much left anyway.
Okay.
We can do that. But really sorry for the delay, everyone. What a terrible thing to happen while talking on a webinar.
It's all good. Thanks, Kate. So moving on to kind of the first example that I wanted to talk about, and this is the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability. So a couple of things. So Exchange is, your mail server. If you're using Outlook, the chances are that the mail server you're using is Exchange. There's a lot of people that probably have moved to Office 365, and Microsoft was able to kind of mitigate that for all of those clients. But a lot of people, including us, even though we've been in the Microsoft 365 cloud for multiple years, you still have an on-prem Exchange server that you use for administration purposes. The tool set that's available in the cloud and Exchange, it's getting better and better, but a lot of people still have that on-prem, and a lot of people still maybe just are not in the cloud, and they just use Exchange locally. So this vulnerability was basically exploited by a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group. The flaw allowed remote code execution. It allowed the exfiltration of data and credentials. Furthermore, these compromised Exchange servers were being used to kind of deploy the Dear Cry ransomware. So taking kind of a bad situation and making it worse for some people. So how do you protect against these types of things? And so kind of the first thing that we talk about, because when you think about vulnerabilities, this is how vulnerabilities typically happen. Vulnerabilities most of the time are found by research groups or security firms that see this like an Exchange server, which is used by everywhere and everyone across the globe, and they say, oh hey, we found this thing and we know how to exploit it, but it doesn't become public. And so they let the vendor know, in this case Microsoft, and Microsoft can put a patch out and then they fix it, no harm, no foul. The 0-day exploits are the ones we're worried about, and that's what this one was. It was a 0-day exploit. This said they didn't know about this vulnerability. It had never been exploited before until this Chinese hacking group did it. And so you always want to have a good patching methodology, or using a good patching solution. A lot of people have used Microsoft SCCM for many years. There's some kind of newer gen ones, SolarWinds, Ninja, Manage Engine, that do a real good job about just giving you kind of a nice console view of like all the machines on your network, all the servers, and what their patch levels are. And so you really want to have a very defined kind of patching methodology there, and which it gives you the ability to kind of quickly deploy patches as needed. So in this case, that layer would have done nothing for you because there was no patch for this. It was going to be weeks later before Microsoft was going to be able to bring one of those, give the patch and let you check to see if you were exploited by this and then how to patch it. But what was this kind of hack doing? Well, it was trying to get data and credentials. So if you have deployed multi-factor authentication across your network and at all the kind of entry points into your network, then yeah, it's not great that this happened, and it's not great that they have your credentials, but those credentials are going to do them no good. As long as they don't have your mobile phone to like hit the duo prompt or the text message that you're going to get to have that second factor, then you're good, and you've kind of mitigated the solution by having that layer in place. The other one, and we're going to talk about this a lot, this next gen antivirus. So these are the names like FireEye and Carbon Black and Sentinel-1. We use CrowdStrike. That's a very popular one out there. So next gen antivirus are a massive step from just typical antivirus. Your typical antivirus is going to scan for files. They can use some sort of like heuristics and kind of look at the way things are working on a machine and identify that as kind of like yeah, that shouldn't be happening. But these next gen antiviruses go just way above and beyond. First of all, like for example, we use CrowdStrike. That's like having a security vendor that is on the front lines of this cyber war, that this is all they do every day, all day. They know about these exploits when they happen. They know about these ransomware attacks. They're the first to know typically, and you kind of got them in your back pocket. Also, you have the agent on all of your machines across your network. So as soon as they see something and they say, oh, hey, we know this ransomware that is running around, or this code execution that's being pushed out, we already know how to stop that, and we can deploy that to all of your endpoints. And that just happens automatically. There's nothing for me to do there. If they learn about something, they push it down to all of our endpoints, we're protected. And it looks for behaviors. It's not just like, oh, that's a virus file, we're gonna stop that. It says, oh, this machine's trying to encrypt data. It shouldn't be doing this. Or this machine is trying to talk to a bunch of computers on the network all at once. That seems like a worm, that is not something that you would expect from this machine. And so you get a much larger response from like these things. And especially with these 0-day threats, next gen antivirus is going to be able to protect you much faster than the vendor, in this case Microsoft, is ever going to be able to deploy a patch. So patching layer, not so good in this example. The multi-factor layer helped a lot. The next gen layer is going to help as well. For most people with this Exchange vulnerability, Microsoft eventually patched it. You should be patched. And then it was, it was pretty much kind of forgotten about and, no longer exploited. So we'll move on to the next one, Caseya. So this one was very, very relevant for us because we use Caseya. Excuse me. So what Caseya does for us, it manages all of our endpoints. So all of our machines, this is the way that when we're doing tech support for our users, this is how we connect to their machine. This is before we were using next gen antivirus. This is how we deployed antivirus. This is how we push out Windows patches. This is how people create a ticket if they need help. So this ransomware attack basically was a Russian group called Revil. And this affected like 36,000 customers worldwide. It essentially affected all of Caseya's customers, which are, mainly like MSPs, service providers, your outsourced IT groups, and internal IT departments. Because if you think about all those things that I just said that Caseya does for us, if you're a managed service provider and you have, hundreds of clients, what you do is you use Caseya to connect to all those machines. And so Caseya, when this happened, it was down for 10 days before they put a patch out. This was actually kind of interesting. It was a first in my career. On July 2nd, Friday around 3 p.m., right before the July 4th holiday, and this is not a coincidence that this is when they did that, I get an email from a person at Caseya that is a VP of marketing. And it just basically says, urgent, shut down your VSA now. So I was like, okay, that seems very strange. Obviously not expecting any of that. Why is it coming from a marketing person? And so it doesn't hurt me to shut down my Caseya server. I can totally do that. I wasn't going to need it for this weekend, so I went ahead and did that. I responded to the person and said, hey, can you kind of verify who you are? Give me something so I know this is real. They were able to do that, and at that point, I knew that okay, this is big. Their CEO was on Good Morning America a few days later. They were down for 10 days, and kind of when we get into this next example, I'll show you kind of the lessons learned from not having that with some of these other threats that happened. But how do you defend against something like this? So layer security, obviously. You needed like a robust tool set. So for us, for 10 days, we were unable to connect to users' machines and help them when they had issues in the very simple way that we normally do it. It's a click of a button. We see their screen, we can control it. We can, help them through whatever issue they're having. But we also have Teams. We also have platforms like we're using now, RingCentral, Zoom, that we could do a screen share and then we could take over. And it's much more mundane and not the easiest for the user. It takes a little bit more time, but that was kind of our plan B. So we could do that. In this case, the next gen firewalls. Most people are probably have next gen firewalls. Have you turned on geo IP filtering? If you haven't, you really, really should. It's all about shrinking your attack surface. So what geo IP filtering does is, we only have traffic coming in on our network for about 5% of the countries in the world. We definitely have no traffic coming in from Russia, China, North Korea, to name a few. And the way a ransomware attack typically kicks off, it downloads to a computer on your network, it phones home to whatever country has sent this, and it gets an encryption key. If they don't have the encryption key, they have nothing to ransom you for. They have nothing to ransom you for. They want to encrypt all your data and they want to say, hey, pay us a bunch of Bitcoin and we'll give you this key back. So that layer, if you don't allow any traffic going back and forth to Russia, that layer probably stops that. With this Caseya threat, the ransomware that they used was a variant of a pretty well-known ransomware. And CrowdStrike, our next-gen antivirus provider, was pretty aware of this. They were on top of this immediately. As immediately as this happened, I was logging into the CrowdStrike. They already knew about it. They were looking at how to mitigate it, and that means they're just working for us. You know, they are working for us. They're basically finding mitigations. They're looking how this ransomware is going to attack, and they're looking for the behavior strain or string, and they're going to basically push all of that info to every agent, all of our computers, and they would have been protected from this. So there was about 40 or 50 customers that the ransomware propagated down to their VSA, their Caseya server on premise. And because that Caseya server is connected to all your laptops, that ransomware propagated their entire network. They said it was about less than 50 of these, and you know that's a nightmare scenario because this is a security vendor that you trust. That this is how you end up getting your, you know, all of your machines encrypted. So those people obviously were calling the FBI. They were, you know, talking very closely with Caseya. Caseya was reaching out to them because they knew who the customers were. And, you know, obviously contacting your cyber insurance vendor, you should have one of those, and kind of working through it. So what this, you know, this last little point is just helped us to identify these single kind of points of failure and understand the backup plans. You know, I don't ever really worry about my Caseya server going down because our users don't really use that. You know, I'm more concerned about making things run all the time. Any of the applications, if engagement goes down for us, which is something that everybody in the firm uses, that's a bigger problem. I got everybody, you know, calling me on the phone, say, hey, what's happening? This is something that I didn't really kind of think about too much in that sense until all of this happened, and it kind of leads us into the next slide. So the last threat we want to talk about is print nightmare, and that one has been very, very recent. I'm sure everybody's at least seen something about this. This was a Windows vulnerability that allows remote code execution. So essentially, if it's allowing remote code to be executed, it can do a lot of things. It can deploy, you know, viruses, deploy ransomware. This was initially thought to only affect Windows servers. So when we first heard about this, this was like, hey, this is affecting Windows servers and specifically domain controllers. So if you're on Windows, if you use Windows, your IT team is managing probably a domain controller or multiple domain controllers. You probably have one in each office, and maybe, you know, a primary and a backup in each office. So a handful of machines that you need to go touch. And the fix to this was just disable the printing functionality. Just disable the print spooler. The print spooler, if you turn that off on any Windows machine, it can no longer print, and the vulnerability would then not have been able to be exploited. So, you know, that was easy. We did that. So then right when we're in the midst of this Caseya thing and we don't have Caseya, they're now releasing information that not only does print nightmare affect domain controllers, it affects all Windows machines. So this is a game changer. So this is now a problem for us. And what I would typically do as soon as I got this information is I would go to Caseya and I would create a procedure that would essentially allow me to push out a patch to every machine on our network that would disable the print spooler. And then we would get the patch and push that out to all machines, and our users would have no idea that it was happening, that it would all be done in the background. But because we did not have Caseya and that server was shut down, we couldn't do this. So we kind of had to, well, hey, what's our plan B? And plan B became just very manual. We sent an email out to the firm and said, hey guys, these things are going on. They already knew about the Caseya thing was going on, this print nightmare thing. You know, everybody's probably thinking, man, these guys are just, you know, getting hammered with this stuff. And we were. But hey, go check for updates, let the updates run. So something that would have been very, very behind the scenes because we use this tool in this layer, or, you know, kind of like patch management layer, now we had to kind of do manually. The other thing that we had in place, and so it wasn't such a bad thing, was this next gen antivirus again. I keep coming back to this. CrowdStrike already knew about Print Nightmare. So even though I couldn't go look and use Caseya, I could get into CrowdStrike and I could see all of the machines that weren't up to date on that patch level and that were still vulnerable to this attack. So, you know, those are kind of those different layers and how they go there, and things just don't always work according to plan. They hardly ever do. And that's just another, you know, instance in explaining how these different layers can really help you in your environment. So the last slide is really just kind of a recap here. You know, how do you do cybersecurity without a cyber expert? You know, you use these vendors. It's when you have a small IT team or you're outsourcing your IT team, you know, the primary function for them is protection of data, is, you know, allowing people to work, making sure the servers are running, making sure your VPN's working, you know, all of these types of things, and helping users. So, you know, someone 100% focused on cyber, even if you had one cybersecurity expert in your firm, I mean, there's too much going on for that one person to just be on top of all of that. So you use these vendors that have hundreds and hundreds of employees that they're focused on this. And that's kind of how you do it. So kind of walking through the list, multi-factor authentication is a must. We've talked about this. Duo is who we use. Can't really go wrong with them. There's lots of other vendors. And don't just turn this on for your, you know, don't let your IT guys just make you use this professionally. Everyone should have multi-factor authentication on all your banking accounts, all your financial accounts, all your email addresses. You know, use this stuff. It mitigates more threats than any other one solution that has ever existed. Next gen firewall is kind of a moot point. If you have a current firewall that's under support, it probably has these next gen features. Are you using these features? Are you using this geo IP filtering? The antivirus, we've talked about that, you know, a lot during this presentation, so I won't go into it, but it's a massive step up. And then employees, that you guys are that last layer of defense, and typically the weakest. Sorry to say that, but I think we all know it's true. So training and testing, you know, we use KnowBe4, FishMe, Mimecast has kind of a training platform. So that's essential. You know, we'll send out the phishing tests periodically. And then when all else fails, your really last resort is make sure you have a solid backup solution. The backup solutions available today are really, really, really good. Dado, Veeam, Rapid Recovery, these things, you know, backup to the cloud or to an offsite. They automatically test restores to make sure it's good, because the lifeline of your firm is your data. Even if all these other layers fail, and let's just say they do, that last layer, you know, you're still going to be okay as long as you can back up, and, you know, as long as you can essentially restore that data. So those are my examples, and that's kind of my part. I think Stacy has a polling question, and it's a layup. So what is the weakest link in your organization? Short passwords, weak encryption, outdated equipment, or employees? And then Kate, I think we do. Have we gone up to the time? I'm not sure, but I think there might be a little bit of time for you to hit those last slides if you want to.
We have 10 minutes, so.
Yep.
So that we can just like lock down
Perfect.
August.
So I can stop sharing.
Great. Yeah, I want to leave room for questions, though. I think our session ends at 10:40. So I'll just run through them really quickly and then leave room for questions. Unless, Sarah, if you haven't really seen any come through, I had to restart my session, so I don't actually see any prior questions anymore.
No questions came through, so go for it.
Go for it.
Okay, perfect. Great. So share my screen. And I'm so sorry again to everyone on the line for the big internet mishap. But I'll go through this last section briefly, and then if anyone does want to add in questions, I'll leave a little bit of time just in case. So we talked through systems we live in. So as a reminder, that's the concept of using systems you already use to do compliance activities. And what I'll say in addition to that is a big benefit here is this checklist format. So what that does, two things. It helps make sure compliance activities actually happen. And it also logs who did it and when. And so that ties back to the evidence of compliance. So obviously a lot of organizations don't have to keep evidence of compliance, but if you have any sort of regulation that you're required to comply with, it's really critical that there's some sort of evidence that these types of activities happened. It's also good from just a risk management standpoint. So, oh, we have this like employee lawsuit. Did they sign the employee handbook? No, why not? Like, do we know that they actually did or not because we stored it, because we saw it in a checklist? So these are the two examples for Asana and Jira that we talked through. The next concept is system spend versus person spend. This ties a lot into what Josh talked about and to my people-centric example. So we'll just briefly run through this section. So this is the process of going through and saying, so we had these ideas about ways to decrease the burden of compliance on our employees. So what are some systems we could implement that makes their lives easier? And the point here is to focus on to think differently about the spend for those systems. So are we spending a lot of money on Expensify and we're thinking of that just as total spend, like the total bottom line spend, or are we thinking of that as a tool to decrease the time spent by our CFO, who's a very high value employee, and all of our employees submitting manual expense reports? So it's attempting to look at system spend in that way to make better business decisions. So for the CTO, there are a lot of systems, obviously, that CTOs and IT teams can leverage that Josh talked through. An easy example is if we want to perform security awareness training, there are training platforms like KnowBe4 that help with that versus the CTO having to come up with something on his own or her own. For the HR manager, perhaps we could look into Gusto or other payroll providers, payroll automation platforms to decrease a lot of her manual, his or her, I'm gonna get this wrong, sorry, manual filing of payroll tax forms and executing payroll. And then we come back to Expensify here. So obviously we do not get any benefit from anyone using Expensify. We use it internally and it's really helpful. But just to show an example of a software that can decrease a lot of this compliance burden. The last one's pretty short, retention. So this is really critical for companies that have to comply with SOC 1 or SOC 2, or even people that even if you just run payroll, that information requires retention. Employee documents, that information requires retention. So there's retention from a legal standpoint and also from a compliance standpoint if you have external people coming in and evaluating your compliance against a regulation. So the two areas that I want to focus you on here for retention, it's in two ways. One is back to this checklist mentality. So if you are doing something that's compliance related, do you have it documented that you did it and who did it? And those checklists are a really easy way to do that. It doesn't have to be, you shouldn't spend as much time documenting that you did a simple task as it took to do that simple task. But if there's a really easy way to document that in a checklist, in a Jira task, in whatever form that you use, make sure that you save that. The other concept for retention, which Josh touched on the backup front, is if there are ways to automate retention settings in your backup software. So say you keep a lot of information in AWS, you can schedule the retention settings or set up the retention settings in AWS so you know that you're retaining things for the amount of time you're supposed to. And that's important because a lot of times retention requirements are like 7 years. So the thought that, well, in 7 years I'll remember, you know, or in 5 years I'll remember that I need to keep it for 2 more years is just unrealistic. It's not something that we can keep track of easily. And that's it for my session.